So with that, I'd like to welcome everybody to the October edition of our Portland Design Thinkers. Welcome. We are the Portland Design Thinkers, a community of creative problem solvers advancing human-centered design literacy through high-quality events, lively conversation, and practice-based development. Well, with that, today I'd like to welcome Leo Frischberg, a good friend of mine and an amazing speaker. I know a lot of you have joined today just to hear what Leo has to say about shifts in the workplace, of which we're all probably living some experiences of how workplace dynamics have been changing over the last few years. So with that, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and your background.
Well, thank you, Deb, for offering the opportunity to speak this evening, and thanks to the Portland Design Thinkers community. All right, let's get started. So the share out that I'm going to share with you this evening is about the work that I've been doing at athenahealth in service of the changing landscape of work, the radical shifts that we've all undergone as a result of the pandemic, the rise in social justice movements, and an emerging technological landscape. But before I get into any of the substance, I just want us to take a moment to reflect on what's happened to us. And it's pretty profound. It's had a profound impact on everybody, young, old, privileged, oppressed, healthy, sick. You know, by definition, no one is immune to a pandemic. And while some of us may have fared well or better than others, I'd like us to take just a moment of silence to remember all that we've lost and gained and learned. Thanks. Now, my hope, of course, for all of us is that these past 2.5 years will have been the worst thing that ever happens to us in our lives, but who can say? So I'm going to do a quick set of questions, and you can either raise your hand on video. If you're off video, use the raise hand option in Zoom, and maybe Deb or Andrea or Katie, you can help count. Please raise your hand if you were commuting into an office in February of 2020.
Looks like we have 11 hands. 12.
11 hands. Great. All right. Please raise your hand. You can set your hands down. I have another hand raise opportunity for you. Please raise your hand if you were commuting into an office in February of 2021. We have to count slower. Hold on. Let's count a little slower. Okay. 0. Still 0. Okay. Now, please raise your hand if you are employed and being asked to come into an office today.
I see 3.
Interesting. So nobody else on the call is employed potentially, or if you are working for somebody, that organization is not requiring you to come into the office at all. Is that a fair assumption? And you can reply in chat if you don't feel comfortable. Cool. All right. Now, for the folks who are coming in, how frequently? Let's start with 1 or more times a week. Okay. Keep your hand up if it's 2 or more times a week. 3 or more times a week. And then more than 3 times a week? Excellent. All right, for those of us who are working from home, if you're open to sharing, and this is where you all get to unmute potentially and participate, how does your work life feel compared to what it was like in early 2020 before the pandemic? I'm open to any sharing that people want to have. Yes, Lonnie,
Yeah,
go for
I
it.
actually decided to rent a studio outside of the house because I felt like I was living at work versus working from home. So yeah, I was just like, I need a cheap space to be, and it doesn't want to be near a toddler. So
I was going to ask if you have others that you're living with who are also thankful that you've taken some
yes,
space outside of the house.
yes, joy has returned to the house.
Excellent. I'll keep the prompt going. You're working from home. If you feel comfortable sharing, how does your work life feel now compared to what it was in early 2020 or late 2019?
And we do have a few people responding in chat.
All right.
On the days I work from home, I would say it's much more productive than when I'm in the office.
More productive, okay. And Mary, you said that there's no change. You consult, school's in person, and your clients are distributed. And then Kelly, less connection with coworkers and managers, and a little bit less, feeling a little bit less engaged. John has suggested that you're a little more flexible. Cool. All right. Now, for those who are working in the office pre-pandemic and are still working, maybe not for the same company, but perhaps remotely, what's been gained? Time with family, way more time, flexibility in where I want to work, and the hours, easier collaboration across time zones, 2 hours a day of not commuting, get to choose surroundings, don't have to be around coworkers I don't like, love that one. More work time and less driving. Cool. Now I'm to move to a different city. Fantastic. And what's been lost? I already heard a little bit earlier about some things that might have been feeling some loss. What else might you be feeling that's lost as a result of working remotely? Camaraderie with coworkers, social time with coworkers, lunches and coffees and walks, dynamic collaborations at desks, knowledge accidents, in-person social skills. Sorry, I laugh at that one, but that's actually not unusual. You know, it's like spot on, right? Great. All right. Well, thank you for going through that. That helps establish some of the starting points of the work that I'll be sharing out with you. Okay. So, athenahealth. We are the second largest electronic health records company in the United States. No, we are not an insurance company. We celebrated our 25th anniversary this year. And we have about 6,500 employees in 7 offices across 12 time zones. We're headquartered in a little town outside of Boston called Watertown. And throughout its years, throughout its tenure, Athena has prided itself on an unusual and human-centered culture. Now, as you would expect, Athena is deeply ingrained in the US healthcare ecosystem. We process millions of orders, tests, test results, insurance claims, and patient records every day. And we have been a cloud-based system since practically our inception. And as a result, we have access to both insurance claims and patient records on a moment-by-moment basis. And all of that has some things to say about and contribute to the work that I'll be sharing out with you. Now, I won't lie. I try not to lie almost all the time. I'm going to show you a lot tonight. This is just one of several presentations that I've been trying to figure out how to distill 18 months worth of work. But these are the key takeaways that I'd like you to remember. So the first one is that the future of work isn't just about office space and real estate, and it's not just about technology enablement or intermediation. It's not about how often we come into work. It's really about the integration of all of those elements with the company's culture and a way of embracing both individual employees' needs and the mission of the organization. Now, the second point may be familiar to those of you who've heard me speak recently. It's certainly a frequent theme of my talks. I like to reflect on Alan Kay and Dennis Gabor's points of view about the future. It's really a fool's errand to predict the future, and it's much, much better to build it instead. And then for this group, I want to share how challenging and rewarding and sometimes surprising the design thinking process has been as we've tested our presumptions about the future of work. All right, so let's get into it. So I arrived at athenahealth on January 2020. My wife and I moved out to Watertown. We had a lovely little house about a mile from the office. Got to walk to work. It was delightful. And then on March 13th, we were all told to go home. But there was, a little bit of discussion about all of that, and it sounded like, this was probably going to be like SARS. We'd probably be back in June. So Athena Nation, which is our nickname for Athenistas, which is our nickname for employees, like every other person on the planet, had been thrust into the chaotic quadrant of David Snowden's Cynefin framework. And for those of you maybe not familiar with Snowden's framework or Cynefin matrix, it's a way of really talking about business decision making. And you probably know it from the names of each of the quadrants: the known knowns, the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns, and the unknowable unknowns. There's really one place you don't want to be in this framework, and that's the chaotic corner. That quadrant's reserved for acts of war, hostile takeovers, assassinations, and pandemics. Hey, welcome to the chaotic quadrant. So you all have had a chance to experience what that's like. It's there's existential threats in the chaotic quadrant. Now, perhaps 2.5 years later, as scientists and survivors, maybe we can step away from that existential dread and the personal loss and the chaos and take some stock. How did we personally navigate that quadrant? How did our communities navigate that quadrant? And how did our institutions navigate that quadrant? So I want you to think back to those early days between January and June of 2020. And again, if you're comfortable sharing, what was the most remarkable thing that you found yourself doing that months before you would never have done? And you can share if you care to. I know in our household it was, washing groceries. That was an unusual act that we had never thought we would do.
Avoiding leaving the house.
Right? Like, I seriously am concerned about burgeoning agoraphobia on my part. Yes. Buying an RV and driving the family across the country. Yeah. 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 Ordering groceries in, like, never. Like, who's going to pick those oranges? No way. I'm not going to have somebody pick my oranges for me. Uh-huh. Yeah. Hand sewing a mask. That's great. Yeah, they're mid 2019. Okay, everybody, you're all going to be hand sewing masks now. Right? Oh my God, it's just so absurd, right? It's just absurd. But right? Also true, right? We maintaining this sort of personal distance and this insane awkwardness about being around other humans. Whew. Crazy times, right? All right. Well, all of that's kind of important to keep in mind. And remote school. Yeah. So this is what the chaotic quadrant looks like when you lay it out on a timeline. Something's going on here with this timeline. Like, this is pretty weird, right? Why was, and this, I'm speaking for Athena, I can't speak for, other companies, although we were certainly observing this in the media and in research reports and so forth. Why was there such a constant pressure to get us all back in? What was driving these attempts to reopen the office? And I open this up to your presumptive hypotheses.
Management thinks you're not working if you're not in the office.
Management is concerned you may not be working if you're not in the office. Mm-hmm. That's the butts in seat metric. Someday over a beverage, I'll explain that. Somebody else? Productivity metrics are all based on in-person behaviors, taxes, insurance premiums, liability, etc. Huge investment in office spaces that are being unused. It's a measurable state of normal. That's a really interesting one. All of these have been interesting. I like those. What was driving this pattern? Assumption that collaboration is best in person. So I'm going to riff off of that one. One of Athena's cultural values is collaboration. And we believe that our position in the market was earned through a pretty authentic desire to work across the aisles, not just within R&D disciplines, but with other functions that are in the company: sales, finance, customer support, and then really most importantly, our clients. We have a very strong customer-centric approach to the work that we do. And one of leadership's biggest concerns, at least at Athena, and the messaging that I was hearing during 2020, was how we could preserve those cultural norms when we'd all been atomized out of the office to our homes. And to that comment, a measurable state of normal, clearly there's some kind of inertia going on here, right? We're anchored in some old way of thinking because that's the way we know. And the chaotic quadrant is pretty, intense. Like it's very hard to sort of believe what's happening. We go into denial pretty quickly, as we all experienced. So those are all good answers, and I'm not going to tell you what the right answer is, but this is the pattern that was going on at Athena. Now, roughly about June of 2021, we had tentatively, we were in tentative recovery mode, and by August we were sort of dipping our toe into the complex quadrant. Now, we were able to make that decision midsummer because of our intimacy with the healthcare ecosystem and the fact that we had access to all of these records that were telling us in the aggregate that the pandemic was clearly ramping down. And our leadership was also involved with and participating in research councils that were getting data directly and not necessarily depending on announcements from the administration or other sources. So by mid 2021, our leadership was pretty certain that September, October was going to be a good time frame for us to return. And so Athena Environment, which is our facilities group, went through the offices in June and they sterilized everything and they set everything up for social distancing. And we put a bunch of masking policies and vaccine policies in place and blah, 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 blah. And within that, in that sort of optimistic framing, they established a task force called the Workplace Experience Task Force, Athena, we, in order to start thinking about what the future of work was really going to be about. And then Delta hit, and then Omicron hit. But neither of those waves were sufficient to knock us back into the chaotic quadrant. Like, we were pretty firmly set. We've got policies in place. We tentatively opened the office. We sort of understood a little bit more. It wasn't so existentially threatening. And yet, this is what it looked like until June of this year. So in spite of entering the complex quadrant, we were still pretty focused on getting folks back into the office with lots of false starts. So that didn't reduce the inertia that we had seen in the prior 18 months. And I submit that this is a fairly typical pattern in the early stages of entering the complex quadrant, especially when you're coming from the chaotic quadrant, right? There's an attempt to rationalize the situation by applying previous patterns and frames to what's going on. But that's not going to cut it in the unknown space. By definition, we don't know what we don't know. It's a shot in the dark to apply any solution in that space, let alone solutions that we know used to work. In fact, we don't even know what the probabilities are of any solution working. So I'm presuming you're interested in this community because you are interested in design thinking. And so you probably are familiar with the UK Design Council's double diamond diagram. And so the question that I sort of rhetorically raise is, what does design thinking look like when you're in the complex quadrant of Snowden's Cynefin framework? Now, we're likely here, right? We're probably in this discover phase where we know it because we don't know what the problem is, and we know there's lots of problems. We're not sure what the right problem is. But we may not even know what the right questions are in the case of the unknown unknowns. So it's quite likely that this model of design thinking isn't going to work when we're talking about dynamics that are going on in the complex quadrant. This model assumes that we can move linearly through each half of the diamond. The complex quadrant requires action. So maybe it's in the right hand, or maybe it's even further right, like we have to actually take action, or maybe it's back here, right? So that this model, which we want to talk about design thinking in terms of some kind of modeling, isn't going to help us in the complex quadrant. And that raises an interesting question for me, and perhaps folks on this call have some interest in this as well, and that is, which design thinking model is most suitable to which quadrant in Snowden's framework? And maybe there's stuff that's been written about that, and I'm not I'm not aware of it. But if you are interested in that topic, I'd love to hear from you. All right, so we're in the complex quadrant, we're in the unknown unknowns, it's unclear what we need to do. What should we do? I'm going to put this out to you all now. That's not a rhetorical question. That's an actual call and response opportunity. What should, if you were consulting with Athena, what would you tell us that we should do?
Leo, can you give us a little bit more context on what you mean, what we should do? Do you mean like business strategy? Could you expand a little?
Well, if according to the prior timeline, there seemed to be some impetus or inertia or momentum to bring us back to the office, but clearly that wasn't working because we kept getting these false starts. What would you recommend to leadership about what the future of work was going to be, given our attempts at getting folks to come back to the office the way it was pre-pandemic wasn't panning out? So Mark suggests that we talk to our employees, we maybe do a quick survey and interview them. Maybe we research what other companies are doing. So that's the sort of question. Brainstorm options for how to work together. Herman suggests we try what you think will work, measure the impact and consequences, based on that, adjust, amplify, dampen, etc. Does that help, Dante?
Yep. Thank you very much, Leah. I think I +1 what other folks mentioned about brainstorm and research. I think we're basically in the second wave of the expand in the double diamond, that second part where, just
over here.
Yeah, the forefront of it. I feel like the expand, try different.
Kind of here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just my opinion, but
yeah, of course. That's what I'm asking for is people's opinions. Great. Let people have the option. May not be feasible. Right. All right. Well, now we'll get into it. So wherever we are, we know we have to figure out what the problem is. Now, there were 15 people on the task force across a variety of roles and functions within the company. And here's a sampling of some of the concerns that these individuals were raising with respect to what the problem is that we needed to address. And I submit that the sheer number of questions and their really radically different scale and focus is pretty typical of the complex quadrant. We have to get oriented to this new reality. We have to sort of take stock and confirm that we're all okay. Like, we're all okay, right? All right, now let's figure out what to do next. But which problem, is the most important to solve first? And Athena took the Black Lives Matter protests and the rise in social consciousness that was occurring in 2020, took it really, really seriously and said, wait, there's a whole DEI thing going on that we need to be absolutely in tune with. But we need to understand what returning to the office means through a lens of equity and through a lens of inclusion. We knew there were Athenistas who were not safe at home. We knew there were Athenistas who couldn't afford to set up an office at home or couldn't afford to move out of the office into some workspace. Single parents navigating homeschool. There was a huge amount of equity concerns going on and not equally distributed, right? And so one of the themes that was going on in the task force was, who gets to talk to us about the problem? Who has the power to even talk about the problems that we need to address? Which I thought was like pretty profound. So before I go into the sort of the process that we use to prioritize all these problems, I want to introduce you to a really key factor that ended up playing an important part in how we went about our problem validation and our go forward approach. So it turns out that Microsoft and MIT sponsored a study on the impact of the pandemic on innovation. Now, recall from the prior slide that our engineering cohort pretty much was wondering what the problem was, given that they were actually showing improved productivity, time after time, sprint after sprint. They were knocking stuff, out the door. And so what I found curious about this study, which I'll explain in a moment, really helped inform the task force's thinking. So you may all know this, but for those who are not aware, we can actually predict the nature of work by measuring the number and types of connections that individuals have with others in their organization. And with those predictions, we can actually look at the potential level of innovation, productivity, and the potential vulnerability that an organization might have. And I think this stuff is really fascinating. It's one of the reasons that LinkedIn was invented. It's a really great sort of technique. So humor me for this sidebar, not just because I think it's cool, but because it really does have a significant impact on what the task force chose to do to address the problem prioritization. So HBR in November, December of 2018 has a wonderful article in which the authors describe sort of 6 archetypal relationships that they call signatures that individuals or organizations could fall into. So in their diagrams, the purple node represents an individual who is a member of that signature or representative of the signature, and the orange node represents an individual who is not. So at the individual level, they talk about ideation and influence signatures. You can see the purple node in the left-hand ideation signature is connected to a lot of other clusters who they themselves are not connected to, whereas the orange node is pretty well connected within their own team. Similarly, on the influence signature, the purple is connected to other nodes who are also connected to loosely connected nodes. And so as a result, they have a chain that they can use to influence, whereas the orange is only associated with a small number of folks who do not have other folks that they're connected to. At the team level, the article goes on and says, well, there's this efficiency signature in which teams that are very tightly connected are getting a lot of work done. Whereas there's this innovation signature in which teams may be more loosely linked, but again, have connections to other clusters that they themselves are not connected. Those clusters remain unconnected. And then at the organization level, there's this idea of silos in which entire units just don't talk to one another very often, except through specific individuals. And then in this vulnerability signature in which suppliers or consultants or support folks are very, very fragilely connected into the main organization. And the concern there is that if the individual leaves, a whole lot of tribal knowledge leaves with them, and a lot of the organization is made quite vulnerable. So what the Microsoft MIT study found after looking at Microsoft employee badge data and Teams data from January to June is that these 2 highly prized signatures on the left were collapsing into the efficiency signature. And that was certainly consistent with what we are hearing from our engineering cohort early on, but also through Athena-wide surveys that we were running. So the point that we wanted to, the point that was made to us as a result of this study, and certainly to some of our leadership that had also read the study, is that it isn't just about improving the productivity of an individual or an individual team. It's about improving the productivity of all teams, which means that individuals or teams need to be sharing the work they're doing and the wisdom that they've discovered with others. If this node disappears, then all of these clusters may very well end up doing exactly the same work and not be aware of it, which we were finding, by the way. But for Microsoft and our leadership, the other profound impact is that by supporting a remote-only policy, we may be facing a significant reduction in the company's innovation funnel. And innovation funnels take a while, like sometimes years. And what Microsoft concluded is they were eating their seed corn, that literally everything might look rosy on a productivity scale, but future productivity would actually be significantly impacted because of this loss of innovation. Now, we've surveyed and interviewed athenistas who haven't come into the office at all since the beginning of the pandemic, and it is a sizable proportion of Athena Nation. Never stepped foot in the office. Either they were hired after the pandemic started, or they've just never been back in. And the data from those surveys and interviews indicate that these individuals are absolutely, happy about the ability for them to be more productive at home. But because several of the task force members are purple nodes, we've actually been able to identify multiple teams over the last several years who are actually solving the same problem in isolation. So, 3 things to take away from this. Increased isolation is going to drive teams towards this efficiency model as they lose their connections and those loose connections sort of wither over time. Perceived improved productivity may need to be adjusted down based on the fact that multiple isolated teams are solving the same problem. And then if we look at it through an innovation lens, the loss of the innovation funnel isn't going to be noticed for years. And that will further depress productivity gains by the increase in opportunity costs that result. This was sufficiently non-trivial in Microsoft's estimation for them to look into a satellite office WeWork style approach to the response of the pandemic. All right, so we're in the complex quadrant. We know all these problems are flying around us. We've got all this data coming in. We've got hundreds and hundreds of research reports. The problem is when you're in the complex quadrant, nobody knows what to do about the situation. And because we came out of the pandemic, really nobody knows. Like nobody's really had this problem before. And so we couldn't talk to a vendor. We couldn't talk to a supplier. We couldn't talk to a consultant. There is no other company on the planet that's figured out what to do that would make sense for us. So we know that simply redesigning workspaces isn't going to be enough. We know that provisioning technology is not going to be enough. We know that simply allowing Athenistas to work from home is not going to be enough. None of those can address those very real DEI concerns that were flooding in, or the impact of isolation on mental health, on our culture, and on our ability to maintain this innovative edge. So being thrust into the chaotic quadrant was like a shock to the system. And the real struggle in the complex quadrant is to not think we're just back to business, because we're not just back to business. This whole idea of framing it as a return to office is actually backward thinking. It's going into the future backwards, because it had an implication that we're going to return to pre-pandemic ways of operating. And there are folks who do not want to return to pre-pandemic ways of operating. So that's not going to cut it. And so we on the task force were like realizing that leadership was really, really interested in getting us back into the office. But there were several leaders who were saying, I don't think that's it. I don't think we even have the playbook. I'm not sure we know what the playbook is, actually. So the defining approach, as some of you mentioned in the chat, in the complex quadrant is you actually have to run an experiment. It's the only thing you can do. It is the absolute only decision you can make, is to run an experiment. In running the experiment, you can at least begin to understand what the questions might be and begin to move into a known unknowns or potentially a known situation. So any approach to the future workplace has to be the result of carefully crafted experiments. Great. So what sorts of experiments can you imagine we'd need to run to address all of these questions being raised by the task force. That's not a rhetorical question. That's a call and response opportunity.
Set up different groups with different environments and see how that plays out.
Cool. Looks like Andrea may have answered this even earlier. Is build out full capability for a hybrid model, fully function digitally, fully function hybrid, then survey, test days in the office, gather feedback, and adjust according to employee feedback. And set up a set of A/B tests. Other thoughts?
Identify whether any of your workers were essential in a office situation, or whether all workers could be potentially remote.
What experiment would you run?
Look at all the processes and steps that they do, and are there any things that would prevent them from doing them remotely? Identify any situations where they might be blocked.
That's good analysis, but what we have to do is take action. What would we do? Because the complex quadrant requires you to take action. The first thing you have to do is probe, meaning run a spike, do an experiment, try something and measure the results. That's what the complex quadrant asks of us.
Could you bring some workers back, a random sample of them, and see if they're more productive versus the people who are still at home?
Bring in a random sample of folks, see, you use the word productive, but we already know they're probably even more productive at home than they are in the office, but we might be able to figure out that they're more something in the office than they are at home, right? Yeah.
I would say one of the other things you could look at, Leo, is whether or not there are any things that are not happening now that all the workers are working from home.
Again, excellent analysis. What experiment would you run?
Are there invoices that aren't getting sent out? Are there payments that aren't getting made? What's happening in our business? And do we have any vendors calling us, telling us, hey, you haven't paid this bill, this thing? What in our environment is not functioning?
Yep. Gotcha. All right. So thank you all. Those are all excellent contributions. Let's pretend for the moment that we could design an experiment and that we could run such an experiment. Let me remind you as well in this Design Thinkerly group that it's easy to forget that not all of the cohorts that are in the enterprise are nearly as comfortable with design thinking, or certainly not as comfortable with the complex quadrant as we may be. Now, for those of us who are working at the edge of innovation in product development, research, design, we kind of expect that level of disorientation, that sort of ambiguity, and this need to try stuff out. For many of us, it's the reason we actually got into the work we're doing. We sort of are delighted by trying stuff, you know. But recall that our HR, leadership, IT, environment cohort, they were all on this task force, and very few of their processes, if any, or their approaches to decision making are really based on design thinking or running experiments. So the complex quadrant has a really peculiar set of demands that these departments may not be as well equipped to handle as R&D is, or as the members of the task force from R&D felt comfortable with. All right, so that's the stage. Before I go into the process and how we got there, let me offer you what we're actually doing, and then I'll move into some of the process that got us here. So our experiments are primarily focused on the most expensive and the riskiest elements of Athena's workplace. And that's our real estate, our furnishings, and our technology. Now, we think this is true to the agile mindset. We're really identifying the highest risk elements, the ones that we really don't understand, and hope to gain the most benefit from reducing those unknown unknowns and moving them into a known unknown or a known quadrant. Now, it's not to suggest that we're only focusing exclusively on the office place. We're running experiments with what I like to call exotic technologies. You can see in my background on my video, we've got telepresence robots that we're provisioning. We've got VR collaboration rooms we're trying out. We have ambient chat rooms that we're using as alternatives to Teams, all in service of trying to kind of figure out what's going on. We have devised 6 different labs in 2 of our offices. Each is outfitted slightly differently. All are large enough to let in teams of 15 people or more to work. And each address a minimum of 6 key activities that we consider fundamental to working in the office. And then one is large enough for an entire subdivision comprising about 40 people that contains multiple areas that support 8 rather than 6 activities. So with the exception of that area, teams are being invited in to use these labs for 3 weeks at a time as their neighborhood. The subdivision folks are simply asked to come in as they normally would, but they have this area reserved for them to play in. So I was really excited because all the stars were aligning. Our environment folks were totally on board. Our technology folks were totally on board. Leadership was on board. I kept pinching myself like, what kind of place am I working for? We're not that kind of place. We don't have like experimental labs. That's not the kind of work we do. We do pretty high compliance required medical records, and this was just so far outside of our usual operating mode. I was really excited. So I'm going to get a little geeky now. Yeah, well, thanks, Siri, but you're not invited. So I'm going to walk you through the experimental design because I think that's where this group might find it interesting. The geekiness involves a century-old version of presumptive design, a 50-year-old investigation into the meaning of work, and then my ambition to be as disciplined and rigorous as we could possibly be. For those of you who know me, I can take the simplest thing and make it the most complicated you've ever seen. And this is not any different. So hold on, here we go. So the task force was divided into 3 parts. We had space, technology, and culture. And because I was the only architect on the team, I led the space sub-team. And the way I looked at it, something was compelling about coming into a shared space. Something was missing from our remote working arrangements. Think about this Zoom call. Think about all the work-related video calls you've been on over the last 2.5 years. Now, focus only on the work-related remote video conferencing engagements. Think about those for a moment. What has been missing? Some of you have said some of these already in terms of the responses to other questions, but let's dig a little deeper. What's been missing as a result of these kinds of engagements? Wow, they're flying across the screen faster than I can read. That's fantastic. Hold on a second. Lack of interpersonal rapport building, clear presence of human energy that you see, reading body language and body presence, eye contact, drawing on a whiteboard, lack of ad hoc, unstructured interactions. Great. Great. And by the way, Suzanne, and looking back at some of the other answers from prior, oh yeah, oh no, I have hundreds of articles from Steelcase. Yeah.
Awesome.
So, yeah. Oh no. We were collecting. We have a compendium of work And I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. Okay, thanks for those answers. Great answers. But wait a second. I'm on the space team, and I just prompted you about a technology. What's that about? That's a rhetorical question. Okay, so we had 3 fundamental experimental questions. This was one of them. Why are we able to do some kinds of work perfectly fine remotely and other kinds of work we're completely failing at? And where is technology intermediation helping? And where is it getting in the way? And then this culture thing, like, what do we mean by that? Like, we still talk about it as culture, and I haven't yet. We sort of know what it. It's the old story. You can't define it, but you know it when you see it. Still, we were very purposefully interested in these questions and figuring out how to run an experiment that would address these questions. But I stood back because I'm the guy who makes things more complicated. And I said, wait a second, what do we mean by work? What do we mean by successful? What do we mean by intermediation? What does helping look like? What does getting in the way look like? Like, all of those were really stopping me from figuring out how to build an experiment that would lead to any sort of insights that we could take action on. So what kind of experiment did we have to build here, right? Now, it turns out that the experiments we ended up running are not your garden variety scientific method-based experiments with random sampling and control groups, right? We aren't really doing A/B tests. We're not doing random sampling and checking out a variable. Like, there's thousands of, well, certainly hundreds, maybe thousands of variables that are going to go on in those labs when handfuls of people are going to do, Lord only knows what they're going to do. So it would be almost impossible to isolate an independent variable and then attempt to figure that out. Not only really difficult, probably counterproductive, especially in the time we have, right? So let me go through those prior questions one at a time to start nailing those. So this is where I started my thinking. As an architect, right, I've been trained to think about space design that's in service of my clients' needs. What do they expect a space to do for them, and what do they expect to do in a space? And in architectural terms, that's called programming. But I wasn't really satisfied with that. Programming is, it's a way, it's a process, it's a way of talking about space and space usage. And there's these taxonomies of space types. So you can say, hey, it's a library. You can say it's a theater. You can say, right? And architects immediately know that there's a whole catalog of buildings that fit that type. But there really weren't, to the best of my knowledge, taxonomies or patterns of programming types. Programming type might be an auditorium versus a classroom, a library carrel versus whatever. And I remembered, oh, Christopher Alexander, he actually was trying very hard to create these patterns of work back in the 60s and 70s. So I immediately checked out his books again, and I started reading through them, and I realized they were no better. I was no further along today, 40 years later, than I was when I first read them. So that wasn't going to be very helpful. And then I looked at Tony Olwick's like Jobs to be Done framework, right? But that really doesn't provide a pattern book of the work that I needed to start from. It's a process by which you can figure out what the jobs are, but I didn't have the time, and I had to believe that somebody somewhere had crafted a catalog of existing patterns that go on in the office. So I went off in search of this catalog of typical work patterns. Enter activity-based work. This was first proposed by Robert Luchetti in the 1970s. It's an American architect. And then Eric Veldhoen and company added on to it in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. And what ABW suggests is that in any given workplace, there are a discrete set of activities that people want to get done. And as you look at this quote, the discussion of ABW goes way beyond buildings and spaces and really starts to talk about culture and how those spaces are effective for the culture of the folks that occupy them. my mind was like blown. Like, this was fantastic. Like, I tripped over exactly the framework that I wanted to start defining so that the task force could start talking about work in a way that was predefined. So how many different activities do you suppose Veldhoen and company identified for office work? No, you can't look it up on the interwebs. I mean,
Probably
you
less
can,
than
but
probably less than a dozen if you're breaking it down into kind of discrete, agree on something, approve something, complete an action, whatever.
great. So you're saying less than a dozen. I see 20 by TWP. Suzanne's suggesting perhaps 200. I'm looking at the prior. Right. Okay, great. So the answer is 21. Now, that's what they came up with. And some of these activities that they came up with had lovely names like reading, spreading out paper on desks, telephone conversations. Remember the telephone? And then a very progressive notion called video conferencing. Now, remember, this is back in the early 2000s, so the work was really done in the 1990s. So we looked at all of that and we said, okay, let's bring that up to speed into the 2020s. What really, if we think 21 is roughly the right number, what do those activities really look like? And we started to rationalize those. So one of the UX researchers on the team with me, a woman by the name of Sophia Zelikman, took it on herself to sort of look at all the different 21 activities. She got them down to 16, to your point, Deb, knowledge work-based activities, right? Athena isn't a manufacturer. We're not a construction company, right? Our employees focus, with very few exceptions, on manipulating abstract symbols or creating alignment among different disciplines or creating new arrangements of symbols that drive innovation, right? So what would our activities actually look like? And you can see them here. Some of the ones that you brought up earlier that you thought were missing from work from home are showing up here as well. Great. So what do we mean by work? Check, we mean this by work, which is great, except that Veldhoen and company really never described what constituted an activity. How do confidential discussions differ from informal social interactions? Are there attributes of each that help define them? And do all activities share the same set of attributes, or do each have a peculiar set? And then back to some of the questions a slide or two ago, why are some of these activities well suited to remote work while others can only be done in person? What are the key elements of an activity that technology intermediation, whether analog or digital, must support? And what's been missing from our video conferencing remote way of working again? Consider formal collaborative engagements. Pretend that you've got a large group and you're in a conference room, let's say, with sticky note exercises at the whiteboard. Now, we know after 2.5 years of isolation that we can work in Mural or Miro and we can achieve a pretty significant amount of collaboration in that context. But we also know, having come back to the office, for those of us who have come back to the office, that remote collaboration just isn't the same as doing it all together in a room. What constitutes that difference? And so that raises the second question in this list of questions. Where is technology helping and where is it getting in the way? And what do we mean by helping? And what do we mean by getting in the way? So Sophia took it again and said, look, by the end of 2021, we sort of understood the 16 activities. And she said, well, let's talk about it in terms of ability to communicate, level of privacy, and then we ended up with isolation as another dimension. And we worked through that, and then we ended up with like 9 dimensions. And eventually I just said, look, this particular framework is not working because it's failing to address the role that technology is playing. And by technology, we're pretty expansive in our definition, right? A conference room is a technology just as much as a video conferencing system. So we really struggled to define a set of dimensions that weren't completely arbitrary. And by February of this year, again, I was convinced that we were reinventing some wheel. So I went out into the interwebs to search for this notion that of what an activity, what dimensions are associated with a particular activity. Now, this next part gets even more geeky, but it's like the really awesome part of this whole experimental design thing that we were engaged in. So it turns out I found a huge amount of frameworks out there, but the framework that really floored me was this thing called activity theory. And many of you may be familiar with activity. I was unfamiliar with activity theory. This was originally proposed by the Soviet psychologist in 1922, a fellow by the name of Lev Vygotsky. Clearly based on Marxist rhetoric and very imbued with the new revolution and the new way of thinking. And really, his triangle is pretty easy to read. It basically is a framework that understands how people, subjects, engage with their environment, artifacts, to achieve their goals. Objects. Seems pretty straightforward. Now, in the contemporary expression of AT, because it's certainly developed over the last 100 years, this fellow named Engstrom in 2008 extends the triangle into a pyramid. And we read the pyramid essentially similarly. One or more subjects attempt to achieve one or more objects, their goals, using one or more artifacts, the environment, technology, based on agreed upon rules, their praxis, their culture, their norms, their policies, via community action, because again, these are activities that in general involve multiple people, in which there is a likely division of labor. Now, it turns out that AT is more than just a theoretical framework for talking about people's engagements with each other and their environment. It's been an absolutely major part of a sub-branch of computer-human interaction called computer-supported cooperative work, CSCW. So in the 70s, CSCW just like pulled this AT stuff out of the archives because it was Marxist. Of course, the US suppressed a lot of this work, except through academic circles. And they focused on this technology intermediation component. So again, my mind is blown. Like first I start with activity-based work and I find a framework that's involving culture, space, and technology. And now I find activity theory that actually accounts for technology intermediation and culture. And it's like, yow, this is amazing. Now, even though activity shows up in both, they are completely unrelated. The way activity is talked about in activity-based work has nothing to do with the way activity is talked about in activity theory. But in any event, it turns out that activity theory was also not just a theory, not just a framework, but also a way for us to figure out what those dimensions might be. So we've got work defined by ABW. We now have a framework in AT for deciphering how one activity might differ from another. And I'm not going to get really geeky with you and how we went about figuring out the dimensions another time over many beverages. But what's wonderful is that activity theory gave us a way to figure those out. So here are our 16 activities. In addition to communication, privacy, and isolation, from Sophia's initial sketch, we identified 7 more dimensions that we think are crucial to these activities' success. Persistence of documentation, the complexity of the interactions that are going on, how many concurrent interactions need to be managed, the knowledge management complexity, Deb, you brought that up, ease of tool switching, how easy is it for us to move from one tool to the next, this notion of embodied cognition, I thought I saw something like that in the chat, this idea of group cognition, maybe that's what I saw in the chat, and this level of synchronization. When we plotted a scalar of none to high for each of the dimensions, for each of the activities, we were really delighted to see that some interesting patterns were starting to come out. And some of those patterns may actually begin to explain why it's relatively easy to work from home on individual focused work, but that remote collaboration becomes really challenging. So let me zoom in on those for a second. Here's what those radar charts look like. So individual focused work on the left, it scores high on only 4 of the 10 dimensions. Persistence of documentation, super critical. What I work on today, I need available to me tomorrow, maybe even a month from now. Privacy, I think the work I do, even if I'm not working on confidential stuff, I benefit from it being private. Isolation, really don't want somebody doing yoga right next to me while I'm or having a beer, talking while I'm trying to get my work done. And then I have a lot of tools, so it should be easy for me to navigate those tools and use them. Maybe some embodied cognition is required. It depends on your working style. Me, I become amnesic if everything is referenced by a Hollywood Squares view of the world. So I have whiteboards, I have other affordances available to me to help me embody the work that I do. But compare that to this beach umbrella of formal collaborative engagements. With the exception of a requirement to be highly synchronized, you can imagine groups splitting into separate rooms. You can imagine people actually collaborating, but not, but asynchronously. Almost every other dimension requires a really high threshold for that activity to be successful. And then look at this one. This one was really great. Like, the only thing that's scoring high on this one is the need for high synchronization amongst the participants. There's no knowledge management going on when we have a beer with somebody. We go to a pub not because we're necessarily sharing knowledge. Sure, we probably are, but that's not our primary purpose for being there, right? So this may start to explain why it's so damn difficult to have fun on a Zoom call. So the cultural implications of our experiments, how were we going to address those? Once again, activity theory has much to say about that. So in Engestrom's approach to activity theory, he provides us with this last requirement, sort of understanding the cultural the cultural dimensions that are going on. And he describes 4 contradictions that a group or an individual have to resolve for an activity to be successful. In the primary contradiction, the group has to adjust one of the nodes of the pyramid. It could be any of the nodes, but in this case, maybe they're trying to get something done and they realize it's too big of a group, so they split into smaller groups. That might be an example of overcoming a primary contradiction. In a secondary contradiction, they're actually focused on the edge. So here they might be trying to achieve a goal, but the tools at their disposal aren't really supporting that goal achievement. And so they have to adjust the tools and adjust the goals in a way to get to where they need to go. In the tertiary contradiction, the group may actually decide that the activity they're doing is the wrong activity, and they actually move into a completely different activity in order to get to the goals that they're trying to accomplish. And then finally, in the quaternary contradiction, the group may realize that it needs to do additional work complementing the current activity in order for them to be successful in achieving their outcomes. So all of that requires a lot of group interaction and a lot of group negotiation. These things don't just happen. Nobody just declares we're going to move to a new activity, unless you have an interesting culture in which that's the permitted way of working. So we immediately said, all right, each lab, right, is going to be a presumptive design, or as Engerstrom calls them, formative interventions, in which we can observe these teams working through the contradictions that they've encountered, whether those contradictions are coming from architecture, technology, or even their own cultural preconceptions about working norms, what their relationships should be, and why they even came in the first place. So in this form of experiment, the specific work that's being done, the desired outcomes, the team composition, or even the tools that are being used are all like secondary. They're subordinate to this group's negotiation of these contradictions. So if we're successful, by the end of this experimental phase, the task force will have discovered that what the potential is going to be for office-based environments, what those environments need, how those environments need to be furnished, what kinds of technologies need to be in place that will support both co-located, remote only, and what I'm calling mixed context activities. Some folks in the room, some folks remote. We're also going to discover what the value is to teams of an environment that enables fluid transition among multiple activities. If we believe that some of these contradictions require a shift in activities, then we need to understand how well these labs are enabling that fluid shift. We're also looking to see to what extent the dimensions we've come up with are accurate, and maybe we're missing some, or maybe the scalars aren't quite the way we think they are. So we should be able to observe the dimensions. And then we fully expect that coming out of these experiments will be a new set of norms that the teams define for themselves that will ultimately represent what we hope will be a future of work. So here's one of the labs with the different activities that we have started. Like, this is the starting position of the game board. And we could be totally wrong. We don't care. It doesn't matter whether we're right or wrong. We think this is the 6 activities we expect people to do. So on the left, there's this formal collaborative engagement. This is an informal collaborative engagement. Maybe this is an informal check-in. Maybe this is social interaction. Here's all the heads down work, the individual focused work, which may permit an informal collaborative engagement in a room off to the side, and then a private huddle room available for confidential discussions. So it doesn't matter how we started. That's not the point. What matters is how the participants actually negotiate these elements in support of achieving their desired outcomes. So we have data capture. Our data capture includes in-person observations. We're asking folks to do diary studies. We're doing time-lapse video capture, and we're doing anonymous surveys. And the data we're looking at includes the use of the equipment, either as we had thought it was intended to be used or through novel ways. The organization of team members, both at the start versus at the end of the 3-week time frame, the frequency of use of specific furnishings and technologies, the perceived and observed fluidity of transitions from one activity to the next. Folks are invited to understand the activity-based work framework, and then they might tell us what they thought they did, but we can look at the videos and suggest maybe they didn't do that, and we can then talk about the videos with them to see what was really going on there. And then obviously all in service of the recognition and resolution of Engestrom's contradictions. And at the subdivision level, we've increased the number of activities to 2 more. Relaxing and taking a break. There's a kitchen right next door. And then this idea of random collisions and share outs. So we're having a share out right now. Random collisions is again noticed in the chat as an interesting thing that really probably only happens in real space. All right, getting close to the end. Thank you for your patience. What did we learn so far? All right, so we really just started. We did the pilots in August. We did some reflections in September, and now we're starting to see the lab spaces getting signed up for. Recruiting's been an interesting challenge. There's a lot of inertia around coming back in, even when we, offer these labs that have the cafe is catering food. We've got nice stuff stocked in the refrigerators, and we've got really cool equipment. We're finding people are still having trouble coming in. The research teams are still trying to learn how to use activity theory as a way. So there's some early stage turbulence in getting this going. But one finding that we think is kind of interesting is that when we've got a mixed context engagement, so think you're in a conference room with a few other folks, and then there's a Zoom call or a Teams call going on, and some folks are remote. We've identified that we're going to need a new role for an in-room folk, somebody in room who's going to be an advocate for the remote team members. Now, this may already be a cultural norm in your organizations. This has certainly not been a cultural norm at Athena. So someone who can actually confirm that the technology is working, that the group process is equitable, and that the communication is inclusive. That's putting that sort of really strong DEI lens on this, which says it's all very well and good that we've got you flattened on the wall, but if you can't hear us or we're not actually hearing you, then you're not really a first-class citizen. But there's something more profound about the equity here and the inclusivity here. And that is, if you don't explicitly define that role and you leave it up to the moment, sort of somebody decides to take that role on, everybody knows the role needs to be done, somebody just decides to do that, then in all likelihood, the lowest power individual in the room is going to take that on. And if that's the case, and that person is in a recurring meeting, is the one who's always taking that on, then that individual is not going to be treated equitably or inclusively. So this needs to be a kind of formal change in our culture and the way we think about working in a mixed context. Another finding, go ahead.
Leo, real quick, I was going to challenge you because there's times in those situations where the person that's flat on the wall monopolizes because they can talk on top of everybody and their voice may be louder.
That's fine. Then this role is still the jockey that maintains that kind of negotiation, right? If there's an explicit role that's, technology facilitator, remote facilitator, whatever, that individual needs to maintain equity within the room, right? Within the activity, not within the room, within the activity, right? So yeah, good point, good point. Now, there was a finding that we actually discovered early on when we ran our own initial experiments last year. There exists no technology today, and if it does, please let me know, that enables a remote plus co-located formal collaborative engagement to be successful. If you expect teams to be in a mixed context where some folks are remote and some folks are co-located, then we are going to establish a policy that says, do the collaboration remotely. Use remote tools, whether it's Mural or Miro or whatever, Figma. Use the tools to do that collaboration. Do not expect to be able to do the collaboration with sticky notes in the room and expect the folks in the remote contexts to participate. And we have tried a bunch of really perverse and interesting technology. So you either establish a policy, that says don't do this, either push everyone remote, bring everybody into the room, or don't expect to be successful at this activity. Now, that's not to say you can't divide the room into two or divide the activity into two and say, hey, you remote folks, you do your thing over there, we're going to do our thing here, and then we'll compare notes. Of course, totally possible to do that. But other issues come into play about, well, is everybody who's remote really supposed to be working? Is that the right mix of folks? Like, there's a lot of reasons that isn't necessarily going to work in every context. Now, as you guys have brought up, and we certainly in our surveys have learned, one of the topmost reasons that people want to come into the office is to socialize and to collaborate with others. And one of the topmost reasons that they want to work from home is productivity. But think about it. We know that collaboration and socializing aren't going to be activities that are going to take up the entire day. So it stands to reason that folks who are expecting to come into the office and suffer a 30-minute commute or worse are not going to just come in for an hour to socialize at the cafe or another couple hours at a collaborative activity and then go home. Like, that seems like a total waste. So we believe that individual focused work is going to need to be done in the office. And so we want to design those labs for that specific reason. The ability to collaborate, socialize, but also to retreat to private workstations to do the individual focused work. But because it's part of your team and it's part of your neighborhood, we fully expect that folks will prairie dog. They'll stand up, they'll say, hey, Johnny, that's interesting, you just brought that up. And then they'll leave to go to the whiteboard and contribute to whatever is going on if it suits their purposes. And then they'll go back to work. That fluidity is exactly what Engström was talking about. And comments from some of our early results are certainly supporting that hypothesis, that permitting this fluid shift from socializing or collaborating back to individual work is being perceived as a hugely positive experience that's going on in the labs. All right, recap, finish, open it up for any further questions, let you go home, whatever it is. So I'm going to revisit those takeaways. The future of work isn't just about office space and real estate. It's not just about technology enablement or intermediation. And it's not about how often we come into the office. Again, it's about integrating those elements with the company's culture that embraces both individual employees' needs and the mission. So we've already determined that new roles are going to need to be formalized, that teams are going to need to rethink what it means to work together, that Athena is going to need to shift its perspective on how to support in-office facilities and IT. And our Athena environment and our IT and HR teams are really internalizing that the key problems to solve are around establishing an environment, whether it's analog or digital, whether it's built or cultural, that enables this fluid shift among the various activities in which we individually and as a team engage during the day. Second point, it's a fool's errand to predict the future. When you're in the complex quadrant, you have to take some action. You have to build some prototype of the future, some artifact that represents the future to reduce the number and types of unknowns. So back in August of 21, when the task force was formed, I knew that we were in the complex quadrant. But and that as a result, we needed to devise and design some set of experiments to understand what we meant by the future of work. But even though I was comfortable with crafting and running these experiments, I didn't really have a clue about what work meant. I didn't really know what variables we should be paying attention to. And I didn't even know what it would look like when we were done. So it's taken quite a while to get all of the team members on board with that sort of haziness, right? Some of the cohorts are still wrapping their heads around, this type of experiment. Even the teams that are working in the labs aren't really treating their experience as an experiment. Pardon me. Some of the participants are unable to articulate, or maybe they're even reluctant to admit, that there's even a problem with the way they've been working. Like what they're doing to overcome Engerstrom's contradictions is completely silent to them. They don't see it. And so we can't just interview them. We have to actually show them what they've been doing and ask them what the hell that was about, because we can't tell by inspection what they've done. And they couldn't have told us by merely reporting after the fact, because they would say, yeah, it all went well. We got a lot done. Right? So for this design thinking group, I want to underscore how challenging and rewarding and definitely surprising that the journey's been to design these experiments that test our presumptions. So this design thinking in service of experimental design in the complex quadrant, the double diamond isn't going to cut it. This learn, understand, make framework that comes out of the Luma Institute really starts to diagram the nonlinear process that we've been navigating for the last, year, right? And I'm not going to go into each one of those things, but pretty much as a recap of everything I've just told you. So there's one last sort of insight that I want to share at the end here. We just often discount good fortune, and we rationalize our success because of our, perceived competency, intelligence, or just stunning good looks. But, fortune favors the bold, says Virgil. Fortune favors the prepared mind, says Pasteur. The harder I work, the luckier I am, says Samuel Goldwyn. How lucky were we to have tripped over activity-based work? How crazy great was it that we found activity theory, both of which were amazingly like accelerants to the work that we're trying to do. So we're in the middle of the experimental process. As we're continuing them, we're iterating on the design, we're iterating and adjusting the labs, we're iterating on introducing folks to how they get in the labs. And as the research teams are getting more comfortable with activity theory, we're finding ways to dig deeper, into how the participants are resolving Engerstrom's contradictions. And it's in those acts of discovery, of asking why, and of observing the participants overcoming the barriers that they encounter, that we're able to get a glimpse into the future of work. So I can now pay attention to any questions that may have come up or comments.
There's a few in the chat, but and for those that need to leave, feel free. But for those that want to stay, we can certainly leave the Zoom open and have a bit of a dialogue. Herman, you had a point.
Yeah, I posted in the chat window. So I've worked in the past with people that were essentially in a different time zone, 12 and a half hours away, that felt more close and more collaborative than the person in the next cubicle. So my question is related to personal interaction style and the willingness to reach out and extrovert, introvert, and whatever you want to throw in that mix. Any research, any insights, how that fits into this whole future of work across remote versus mixed versus online?
So that falls into the lower left corner of the pyramid about sort of rules of engagement and interpersonal relationships and what is considered norms and what is not. And the real experiments that are going on here are saying, okay, so you're having trouble collaborating with the people in the room, but you're not having trouble collaborating with the folks from afar. What's that about? Let's dig into that. Let's find out to what where those contradictions are causing, or what's causing that contradiction. In the context of the dimensions, that's an interesting question in terms of have we captured that with respect to the dimensions. One way that might be captured is how well has the facilitator managed the complexity of the interactions going on, and to what extent is the facilitator asking for folks in the room to step up and participate versus not having to do that so much for this particular remote crowd. So yes, we know from a lot of studies that we've done on collaboration in general, there's a whole bunch of things, culture and power dynamics and ability to communicate, even being able to understand each other's English. All of those things have major impacts on the ability to collaborate. There's no question about that. But from our perspective, we sort of accept all of that as part of the cultural landscape, the cultural environment. And the question for us is, to what extent are these labs or these experiments revealing novel ways that folks can overcome those barriers, or revealing that in some cases those aren't considered barriers? And now we can step back and look at that data and say, isn't that interesting? This group really had a lot of trouble doing this. This other group was kind of doing the same activities, but they weren't having trouble doing that. What's going on there? That's the way I would answer the question.
Sometimes I wonder if it has to do with how long people have been working remotely, because as somebody who's worked remotely on and off for over 20 years, I've kind of developed different techniques and styles than people who I try to collaborate with, who this whole thing of working virtually is new and novel to them.
Yes. If you think about just the activity of collaboration, we know because of computer-supported cooperative work, there's just been 50 years of literature about how technology can intermediate collaboration, or in this case, coordination. But what about all these other activities, right? And if really socializing is like a critical part of why we want to belong to a tribe, like why we want to belong to this particular company. Look, our attrition rates for new hires during the pandemic are through the roof. They're absolutely, totally changed from what the attrition rates for new hires were pre-pandemic. HR is really freaking out, right? And so why is that, right? And partly it's because some of the things you brought up in the chat, like we haven't been able to establish that close human connection, which has very little to do with work and everything to do with, I want to work with you. I want to be in the same room with you. I want to play with you, right? And so there are lots of other reasons to come back into a shared cave besides collaboration, even though we know that collaborating in person has this has this thing about it, has some additional dimensionality to it, which we find helpful. So think about all the other activities and their impact on the company or the impact on the worker's experience. About people who used to work in the office versus those hired in a remote world. Right, there's entire companies like GitHub who've never had offices. There's entire companies who actually have built their culture around being remote. And obviously those attract a certain group of folks. It is certainly one of the things that has been nagging at the back of my mind. It's like, does that mean those companies are not innovative? How are they able to become innovative when one of the things we know that's probably important about innovation is that random collision that occurs in the hall? How have they made that activity? How have they simulated that activity or intermediated technologically to support that activity, right? So yeah, I'm kind of curious about those companies that have been purely remote and how they're navigating some of these activities, and whether or not there is a demonstrably, measurably different level of innovation going on in companies like that versus companies that choose to work
And
together
Leo,
in
we
an
have
office.
one person with a hand raised, and we have 2 or 3 people that have entered things into the chat.
Well, you guys can help me figure out who came first, because I wasn't paying attention.
I think David was.
All right, David, go for it.
Hi, Leo. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Sorry, I can barely hear you.
Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Okay, great. Hi.
I was curious about the why behind management trying to get people back into the office. It started off with we're better together, and we should all be back together, working together and collaborating, like you said. And then it sort of switched to, it's wonderful when we're all in the same room together. Come on back, we're going to have pizza day, or whatever it is. But at the same time, I think that it's cheaper for companies not to have everybody in the office. It's cheaper to outsource the office back to your home, and then they can have fewer cubicles and save on rent. What do you think is driving this idea that we need to get everybody back into the office? Is it just fear of the unknown? We don't know how this remote work works?
So I think there's 2 primary drivers. The first is inertia, right? They just aren't willing to accept. They're still in denial. They made a huge investment in our not real estate, but in our offices. Our offices are really gorgeous. They're wonderful. And they've been designed specifically to enable a lot of random collisions and a lot of innovation. Real fear about the loss of that. And this inertia that says, well, it really was kind of a mainstay of our attraction. It's part of our culture. These buildings are actually built into, the way we think about ourselves. And so there's a lot of identity crisis going on there. And it's not, it's not unfair, right? It's a reasonable thing to be concerned about. But I think the second one is a true, when you talk about it's cheaper to have everybody work from home, we need to really check the privilege there, right? Not all of us can outfit our rooms the way we've outfitted it. And even if Athena IT says you have a budget of $1,000 to do whatever you want in your house, that presumes you have a house. I got people on my team who have 4 roommates. They have to negotiate who gets to use the living room for a call. I got parents who are freaking out because they can't get their jobs done and get their kids schooled. Like, this is real. And this has nothing to do with leadership's desire to bring us all back in the office. This is real bad. There's mental health issues. The mental health in this country has really deteriorated over the last 2.5 years for lots of reasons, let's presume, but certainly isolation has not helped, right? And so, no, while it may be novel to us right now, and we all most humans sort of enjoy novelty every once in a while, I suspect this is going to become quite wearing on people. It has become quite wearing on people. This blurs day. I wake up every morning. I can't tell you what day of the week it is if Outlook wasn't there. I can't embody my experience. It's sitting in front of a damn screen, right? And so I'm literally losing it. I am literally losing cognitive capability. This isn't good. This is bad. And so we've got to solve for that. And solving for that may be technology intermediation within the home. Great. It may be that we afford folks an out of the house place to do work that makes it safe for them and makes it safe for their families. Great. It's not necessarily cheaper, right? And once we start talking about cost shifting and really agreeing that the equitable response is to not cost shift onto the Athenista shoulders, but to own that cost, it's just a cost shift. Upgrading everybody's routers. What about our attack surfaces? InfoSec is just freaking out about how exposed we are. And we have really, really, really major exposure problems because we handle all of this PHI. So yeah, it isn't the answer of working from home for 100% of Athenistas 100% of the time is not going to happen. So leadership is keeping their eye on that, right? And recognizing there's this very strong DEI vector here that needs to be, it has to be embraced. Otherwise, we're going to lose people. They're going to go someplace else where they're treated better, right?
Great. Thank you, Leo.
No, thanks. Great question, David. Looking down, how do you know attrition rates due to lack of personal touch and relationships? So we do a lot of exit interviews, right? We interview, we also know the cohorts that are most likely to leave versus the ones that stick around. And the junior cohorts, the ones who are fresh out of college, or maybe this is their first job, or maybe it's their second job, who really need that kind of social engagement, who actually want to come to work for social engagement, those are the ones who are feeling the burn. And specifically during the early stages of the pandemic, when we were all kind of flat-footed about how to respond to that, we saw, a pretty major loss. Now, I don't know if they've landed someplace else in which they, are treated better or found a better home, or whether they've just realized that it's going to be like this lots of places, or whether the new organization they've come into is perhaps a little bit more attuned to the needs of a remote worker. So we know based on cohort, we know based on exit interviews, and we also know based on some sentiment surveys that we've been doing for folks who are still in, like managers are really keeping, I know my manager cohort that I'm part of is keeping very close tabs on all of the folks who work with us and make sure that they're doing okay. And if they're not, we're interceding. Like, it's part of the job now. So in the early days, we weren't quite tuned. My last company shifted to fully remote, set up random coffee in Slack that randomly assigned pairings. I found some of them fun, interesting, awkward, useful, or a waste of time, depending on. Right. So we have that too. We have something called Icebreaker that gets set up, and every month I get a new Icebreaker, random person to talk to and learn and meet. It's so contrived. It's just so contrived, right? I go to the cafe. I did this. I was back in the office in, I don't know what month are we in? All right. I was back in June, and I'm sitting at a table with one of my reports, and we're doing a one-on-one, and we're in the middle of this hallway in which there is just traffic going to the cafe and back and forth. I had 4 separate conversations with people while we were sitting there in this one-on-one, and I looked at him and I said, maybe we should move to a private location because you're not getting my full attention. And he goes, no, this is great, because he was a new hire. He said, I'm loving this. I'm loving to see that all of your little shadow network is kind of showing up as we're sitting here talking, right? And I introduced him to all these folks, so he got a chance to meet some of these folks. You can't plan that, right? I mean, you could plan that, but it's not going to be the same. So yeah, it's possible to simulate it. Right, templates, right? I mean, it's getting even more and more contrived. Like, what can we do to help build in spontaneity, right? Now, we think that these, there is a technology enablement, we haven't quite tested it yet, these ambient chat rooms, like GatherTown or TeamFlow. If you establish those as drinking, kind of drinking pub-like social engagement kinds of engagements, and set up the rooms in a way that allows for spontaneity, and you invite the right people, meaning not just your team, but others who you want to make sure everybody talks to, that's when that kind of thing can happen. And it's much less planned and much more closer to the random collision opportunity. Tell extrovert happy, go to hybrid, and go to the office several days a week. Said it was mostly extroverts. Right. I mean, that's certainly true. But it's interesting. We just did an interview with a team that was in one of the labs, and it was a team of, I think we could clearly, they would call themselves introverts, right? Very, very deep engineers doing really, really like focused problem resolution on, on our network support center, and they're coming in and they're trying to work through some really intense and really difficult, knotty problems. I think all of them would score, closer to the introvert side. They talked about this human need for connection. They talked about why this is so great, because they can finally see people face to face and they can finally engage with them. Now, how they go about engaging may be in a more introverted way. Great, whatever. But at least we're hearing that there's just this really, we need to talk, we need to touch people. We need to see them. We need to be in a room with them, right? What is that? Why, right? That was extremely fascinating. Thank you. Great. Feel free to check in with me, Natalie, afterwards if you want to talk about more. Right. So the templates that I use are the same templates that I use when I do my onboarding. When I first come into a company, I have a template of questions that I like to ask everybody. And so I give that to my team too. And I say, hey, when you meet somebody new in an office environment, you might want to ask them these kinds of questions. And, one of them is like, hey, what keeps you up at night about work? After a few getting to know you, you can ask what keeps you up at night in general. But if it's the first time at work, generally, what keeps you up at night? And you really learn a lot about what's driving them, what they're passionate about, what's problematic. So there are some templates you can use to sort of get to know people, but I think that's it. I don't see any further, and I've kept you far longer than I think you expected, but you are more than welcome to reach out to me after the fact and continue the conversation.